All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works, right? You give us the material, and we kind of become your personal researchers, digging through it, pulling out the stuff you really need to know.
Exactly. It's like having a shortcut to becoming an expert, right? And for this deep dive, the source you gave us is, well, pretty intriguing. Martial arts Dim Mak. Looks like we're going to be exploring some self-defense techniques, those so-called nerve centers and pressure points that this book is all about.
Yeah, the whole kind of mystical, almost legendary stuff, but also how much of it is actually practical, real world self-defense? How do we separate fact from, well, fiction? I mean, I've seen enough movies to know that not everything you see on screen is, how should I put it, scientifically accurate.
Right, and that's one of the things the book addresses right off the bat, like what self-defense isn't. It's not, warfare. It's not about revenge. It's not even really an art form in this context. It's definitely not some sport with rules and referees.
So no fancy choreographed fight scenes like we see in, those action movies, right? It's got to
Right.
be something more grounded, more real.
Exactly. So the book really emphasizes this idea of modern self-defense being about preparation,
Mm,
about, understanding how to minimize the chances of being attacked in the first place.
yeah.
And then if you absolutely have to, using just enough physical action to, well, to get yourself out of that situation.
So it's more about not being an easy target, right? Than becoming some kind of like super skilled fighter. Because, I mean, not everyone wants to be a martial arts master. And let's be honest, not everyone has the time or the ability to become one?
And that ties in with the ethical and legal aspects of it too, right?
Mm.
Which the book also talks about. Like any force you use has got to be proportional to the threat, just enough to stop the attack, get away, or prevent it from happening. Not about going overboard. It's not about causing more harm than absolutely necessary.
Yeah, it's got to be about de-escalation, right? And also, like, recognizing that not every threat is the same. The book makes this point. Real life isn't some, black and white movie where every bad guy is a total monster out to kill you. There are shades of gray, right? Someone being a bit of a jerk isn't the same as someone actually trying to, seriously hurt you.
Right. And that's where the book really emphasizes the importance of assertive self-control. Often just, standing your ground, making it clear that you're not going to be a victim.
Yeah.
It can be enough to stop things from getting physical in the first place.
It's about sending that message. I'm not an easy target. And the book talks about that it's not always about, fancy moves or knowing how to break someone's arm. It's about having that mental preparedness, that awareness, and then knowing what level of response is appropriate for each situation.
Which brings us to, well, a topic that always gets a lot of attention. Nerve centers and pressure points. And just to be clear, the book points out that those aren't like official scientific terms. They're more, I guess you could say, common terms used to describe certain areas on the body.
Okay, so how does the book define them? Because I'm sure a lot of people have heard those terms, thrown around in movies and stuff.
So a nerve center, in the book's context, is basically a spot on the body that's particularly sensitive to pain because, well, there's a bunch of nerves kind of bunched up close to the surface. Like, think about your shin bone. It doesn't take much to make that hurt, right?
Ooh, yeah, I've bumped my shin enough times to know that.
Right. But the book also makes it clear that not every area with a lot of nerves is necessarily a nerve center in this sense. Like, your butt has a ton of nerves, but it's not really a very pain-sensitive spot.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about pressure points? How does the book define those?
Well, a pressure point, according to the book, is a spot that's especially vulnerable to injury or like really intense debilitating pain when you apply pressure there. So your windpipe, for example, that's a pretty good example of a pressure point.
Yeah, I can imagine that wouldn't feel too good. So we've got these nerve centers and pressure points, and a lot of martial arts, especially the older ones, they were developed, what, like centuries ago, right? Before people really understood how the body worked.
Exactly. And the book kind of delves into that historical context, which is pretty fascinating. Like some of these ancient fighting skills, they predate our modern understanding of anatomy and physiology by a long shot.
It even mentions some of the, the more mystical beliefs, right? Like the idea of these reptile spirits supposedly living inside us, controlling our feelings and movements. It's kind of wild to think about, that those were some of the ideas people had about the body back then.
Right. And the book cautions against, just blindly accepting those old ideas as fact.
Mm.
Our knowledge of anatomy and physiology has come a long way. And that's why it's so important, especially if you're teaching self-defense, to make sure you're passing on accurate information. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's our responsibility to, well, to correct it.
So, maybe crack open an anatomy book, right? Or
Yeah.
take a class if you're really serious about it.
Exactly. And that leads us to the broader concept of what martial arts actually means, right? Because the book makes the point that it's really an umbrella term for, well, pretty much any system of fighting, both with and without weapons.
Yeah, we tend to think of, karate or kung fu, right? But really, it could be anything, like boxing, wrestling, even fencing. They're all martial arts. It's more about, like, the organized system of combat than where it comes from, right?
Right. And the book breaks down the main types of unarmed fighting into, like, grappling, throws, striking with the hands, and striking with both hands and feet. And it points out that a lot of these well-known styles, like judo, aikido, wrestling, boxing, karate, jiu-jitsu, kung fu, and atemiwaza, they all kind of fall into one or more of those categories.
And it seems like a lot of those styles, especially karate, kung fu, jiu-jitsu, and the atemiwaza, they do specifically make use of those nerve centers and pressure points that we were talking about, right?
Right. And it's good to keep in mind as a listener that, a lot of people use these terms, martial arts, karate, kung fu, kind of loosely, right? Like they don't always mean exactly the same thing to everyone. The book actually suggests checking out the Encyclopedia Americana if you want a really good overview of like the actual differences and similarities between all those different fighting styles.
Now let's talk about something that's, well, definitely a part of any kind of physical confrontation: pain. And the book gets into how pain actually works in the context of self-defense, which I found pretty interesting. Like, it's not just about causing pain, right? There's more to it than that.
Right. It points out that pain is really this combination of like a stimulus, something that triggers your nerves like a blow,
Yeah.
and then your body's own individual response to that stimulus.
And I mean, everyone's pain tolerance is different, right? Some people can handle, like, going to the dentist without any anesthetic, and others practically faint at the sight of a needle.
Exactly. The book gives those examples, and it also talks about how, like, if someone's already feeling anxious or scared, that can actually make them experience pain more intensely.
So, like, if you're already on edge, worried about being attacked, that initial blow is going to feel even worse, right? It's all connected to your mental state.
Right. And that's where, the book kind of makes a distinction between, like, traditional combat training, which often focuses on, developing super high-level fighting skills and being able to inflict as much pain as possible, and what they call practical self-defense.
So in a battle, the goal might be to, wound or completely incapacitate your opponent. But in a self-defense situation, you might only need to inflict just enough pain to, to kind of shock the attacker, make them think twice about continuing. It's about disrupting their plan, not about, winning a fight.
Exactly. And the book even makes the point that sometimes effective self-defense doesn't involve any pain or physical action at all. Like, just being assertive, refusing to play the role of the victim that can be enough to deter an attack. It's about presenting yourself as someone who's not going to be an easy target, right?
Yeah.
Someone who's confident and, not going to just stand there and take it.
So it's almost like, you're disrupting their script, right? They're expecting you to react one way and you do something completely different.
Exactly. And that can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than knowing any fancy fighting techniques.
No, I got to ask about something that's always fascinated me, the idea of deadly blows. Those almost mythical techniques that supposedly can kill someone with a single strike.
Yeah, the book addresses that too, and it basically debunks a lot of those myths and legends, like, the idea of someone ripping out a beating heart or pulling out a spine with their bare hands, or those stories about deaths that happen without any physical contact, or the 7-year death that supposedly results from some secret technique.
And the one that I've always wondered about, the blow under the nose that supposedly drives the nasal bones up into the brain. Like, is there any truth to that?
The book tackles that one head on.
Yeah.
And it basically says, no, that's not how anatomy works. Like, most of your nose isn't even bone, it's cartilage.
Yeah.
And even the nasal bones themselves are pretty fragile. There's just no way they're going to, like, pierce the skull and get into the brain. Any fatal blow to that area would be from, a severe concussion or brain hemorrhage, not from bone fragments.
So it's more about the shock to the brain, right? Not about some magical technique that sends your nose bones into your brain.
Exactly. And the book kind of frames all these legendary stories as, well, folklore. Like, they might have some cultural significance, but they're not meant to be taken literally.
It's about being able to separate fantasy from reality, right? Especially when it comes to something as serious as self-defense.
Right. And it also makes the point that anyone who can deliver a really forceful blow to a vulnerable part of the body, regardless of their martial arts style, could potentially cause a fatal injury. There's no, like, secret death touch that only a few select masters know.
So it's about power and accuracy, right? Not about some mystical technique.
Exactly. And speaking of misinformation, we got to talk about how martial arts are often portrayed in the media, movies, TV shows. They're not exactly known for their accuracy, are they?
Yeah, and the book reminds us that those are entertainment, not educational resources. And even news media, they sometimes get things wrong, or they might sensationalize a story without really verifying the facts.
Right. Like, the book mentions that story that went around about a guy supposedly being knocked unconscious by pressure applied to his armpits. And it basically says, yeah, that's probably not what happened. It's way more likely that the guy just fainted from the stress and anxiety of the situation.
It's about understanding that real life isn't a movie, right? Things don't always happen the way they do on screen. Now, what about hand conditioning? That whole thing about toughening up your hands. Is that really necessary for self-defense?
The book actually argues that, for the most part, it's not. Like, it's not really needed for sport karate or jujitsu, and it's totally irrelevant in judo.
Why is that?
Well, in a lot of sport karate, there's either no contact allowed at all, or you have to wear gloves. And even the ones that do allow some contact, if you've got super conditioned hands, they often make you wear extra padding to protect your opponent.
So it kind of defeats the purpose, right? If you got to cover up your conditioned hands anyway.
Right. And in judo, striking is totally against the rules. So hand conditioning doesn't really come into play.
Okay, so what about for like actual self-defense situations?
Well, the book's point is that in most real-world self-defense situations, you're not going to need to, like, punch through armor or anything like that. With a good understanding of anatomy, you can strike effectively without needing rock-hard hands.
Yeah, I mean, a well-placed kick to the knee or a punch to the nose is going to hurt regardless of whether your hands are like calloused or not.
Exactly. And actually, the book warns that too much hand conditioning can be harmful. Like, it can cause permanent damage to your hands, make it harder to do things that require fine motor skills, and even create legal problems if you ever have to use self-defense. People might assume that you were, like, looking for a fight, not just trying to protect yourself.
So it's best to just avoid it altogether, unless you're like specifically training for breaking boards or something like that, right?
Right. Now, the book also gets into the issue of, like, how accurately we can describe the effects of different blows. And it makes this distinction between, what's accurate enough for general self-defense guidance and what would be needed for, like, a truly scientific evaluation. Like, to be really scientifically accurate, you'd need to measure the exact force of the blow, the precise point of impact, the person's medical history, their pain tolerance. It gets really complicated.
Yeah, real life isn't a lab experiment, right?
Exactly. So the book explains that it relies on, the best available information and uses terms like possible and probable to acknowledge that it's not always going to be perfectly precise.
It's about giving you a general understanding, right? Not about claiming to have some perfect formula that can predict exactly what's going to happen in every situation.
Right. And it emphasizes that there are so many factors that can influence the outcome of a strike, like the person's overall health, their emotional state, the force of the blow, and of course, the relative size and strength of the individuals involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. A punch from a, you know, professional boxer is going to have a different effect than a punch from someone who's never thrown a punch in their life.
Exactly. And the book actually analyzes how the effects of blows can differ depending on, well, who's hitting who and how big they are. Like, it compares what happens when two people of equal size strike each other versus a larger person hitting someone smaller
Mhm.
versus the other way around.
So, like, is it always an advantage to be bigger and stronger?
Well, it can definitely make a difference, but it's not the whole story. Like, the book uses the example of an open hand strike to the nose. If two people of roughly equal size exchange those blows, they're both going to feel it, but the chances of serious injury are relatively low.
Okay, so what about if a larger person hits someone smaller?
Well, then the risk of injury goes up significantly. Like, a blow that might just cause a bloody nose in an equal fight could potentially break the nasal bones or even cause a concussion if a larger person delivers it to someone smaller.
And what about the other way around? If a smaller person hits someone bigger?
Well, they're less likely to cause serious physical injury, but they can still cause pain and disrupt the attacker's plan. The key is to choose techniques that don't rely too much on brute force.
So, like, what would be a good example of that?
The book highlights kicking to the knee or the shin. Those are really effective techniques, regardless of size differences, because those areas are just inherently vulnerable.
And, I mean, they're pretty easy to hit, right? You don't need to be a martial arts expert to kick someone in the knee.
Exactly. Plus, it lets you keep some distance, which is always a good thing in a self-defense situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the general concepts. Now let's get into some specifics. The book goes through a whole bunch of nerve centers and pressure points, and it actually has photos to show you where they are.
Right. It's like a little anatomy lesson.
So let's start with the temple area of the head. A lot of people think the skull is thinner there, making it more vulnerable. Is that true?
Actually, the book debunks that myth. The skull bone is generally the same thickness all around, but the shape of the bone in the temple area can make it more susceptible to, like, shock waves from a blow, which can be transmitted to the brain.
So it's not about the thickness of the bone, it's about the shape, right?
Right.
And any strong blow to the head, including the temple, can be really dangerous, even fatal.
Exactly. Now, what about the nose? That's got to be one of the most common targets in any fight, right?
Yeah, and it's pretty hard to miss.
Right. And a good strike to the nose can cause a lot of pain, bleeding, disorientation. There's also a risk of breaking the cartilage or bone, especially if you're hitting someone smaller.
What about that upward strike under the nose? That's supposed to be really dangerous, right?
Well, the book actually says that it's not as dangerous as people think. It can definitely cause pain and distract the attacker, but it's unlikely to be fatal.
So it's more of a distraction technique than a knockout blow, right?
Exactly. Now, the eyes are obviously a very sensitive target, but the book cautions against using them as a primary target, except in truly life-or-death situations.
Yeah, you don't want to risk permanently blinding someone unless you absolutely have to.
Right. Now, the chin is a really good target, especially for smaller individuals. A solid upward blow under the chin can snap the head back, throw the attacker off balance, and even knock them unconscious.
Also about leverage, right? Using your opponent's weight against them.
Exactly. Now, the ear, it's not the most practical target.
Yeah.
And it carries a risk of causing hearing damage, especially if you're hitting someone smaller than you. But the area right below the ear, that can be pretty sensitive to pressure.
Okay, and what about the throat? That's got to be one of the most vulnerable areas on the body, right?
Definitely. The front of the throat, the Adam's apple, that's a really high-risk area.
Yeah.
Any moderate to strong blow there can cause serious injury, potentially even fatal.
So that's one to avoid unless you're in a truly desperate situation, right?
Exactly. Even light pressure on the windpipe can be dangerous. Now, just behind the jawbone, there's another sensitive area with a lot of nerves.
So a good jab there would cause a lot of pain.
Right. And then there's the hollow of the throat, just below the Adam's apple. Even slight pressure there can push the windpipe out of place, and a harder blow can be really dangerous.
Okay, so we've covered the head and neck. Let's move down to the shoulders and arms. What about the shoulder muscles?
Well, the spot where the neck and shoulder meet, that can be a good target. A strong blow there can cause pain and maybe even temporarily paralyze the arm.
But that's probably not going to be as effective against someone who's much bigger than you, right?
Probably not. Now, the collarbone, that's actually a lot harder to break than people think. It takes a lot of force or a really precise strike.
So probably not the best target in most situations.
Right. Now, the base of the skull, that's an area you really want to be careful with. It's incredibly dangerous to strike there, especially against someone who's smaller or frail.
Yeah, you could cause permanent damage, even death. So definitely not a target for casual self-defense.
Right. And then there's the base of the neck, which is often shown in movies, but in reality, it's not very practical, and it can be pretty dangerous.
So we're better off aiming for the chin or the side of the neck if we have to go for the neck area, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, moving down to the torso, what about the back? Is that a good area to target?
Well, there's that spot between the shoulder blades that some people talk about, but the book says it's not very reliable and it can be risky.
Right. And then there's the kidneys, which are obviously vulnerable, but they're also partially protected by the ribs, so it takes a really strong blow to cause serious damage.
So maybe not the best choice for a smaller person defending against a larger attacker.
Right. Now, the solar plexus, that's a classic target. A good strike there can knock the wind out of you, and a really hard blow can cause serious internal injury.
But it's also a bit of a tricky target to hit, right? You got to get the angle just right.
Right. And it's not going to be as effective against someone who's significantly larger than you, unless they have some kind of, pre-existing condition.
Okay, and what about the sides? Are there any good targets there?
Well, the area just below the last rib, that can be pretty sensitive. You can dig in with your fingers or use an open hand strike or even grind a knuckle into that area.
So it's good for causing pain, but not necessarily for causing serious injury.
Right. Unless you deliver a really forceful blow, which could potentially damage the spleen.
Okay, so we've covered the upper body. Let's move down to the arms and legs. What about the elbow?
The bend of the elbow is a really good target. It causes pain, bends the arm, and you don't have to be in close range to hit it.
So perfect for a smaller person defending against a larger attacker.
Exactly. And a harder blow can even cause that temporary numbness, like when you get your funny bone.
What about the outside of the elbow?
That's not as practical, but if you can hit it while the arm is extended, you can cause some pain. And a really strong blow could potentially injure the cartilage.
And then there's the forearm. Any good targets there?
Well, the fleshy part of the forearm, about 2 inches above the wrist, that's pretty sensitive. A moderate blow can cause pain, and a harder one can even cause a bone bruise.
So good for distractions and kind of disrupting the attacker's rhythm, right?
Exactly. And then there's the back of the hand. If you can grind or dig a knuckle into that space between the tendons and bones, that's going to hurt pretty much anyone, regardless of size.
So lots of options for the arms. What about the legs?
Well, we've already talked about the knee and shin. Those are prime targets. But there are a few others worth mentioning, like the inner thigh. A good strike there can cause a lot of pain.
And that's an area that's relatively accessible, right? Even if someone's wearing pants.
Right. And then there's the instep, the top of the foot. A good stomp there can be really painful.
Yeah, I can imagine. There are a lot of little bones in the foot.
Exactly. And a hard enough blow could even break some of those bones. The ankle is another vulnerable spot. You can kick it to cause pain, or potentially sprain, or even break it.
So lots of options for the legs. What about the more, I guess you could say, taboo areas, like the groin?
Well, the book doesn't really recommend targeting the groin or the lower abdomen in general. Those areas are obviously sensitive, but they also house a lot of vital organs.
So you could end up causing more serious damage than you intend, right?
Right. And they're also like the ethical considerations.
Yeah, it's not exactly self-defense if you're like intentionally trying to cause permanent damage to someone's reproductive organs.
Right. So those are better left as a last resort, if at all.
Now, the book also talks about how clothing can affect your target selection, right? Like if someone's bundled up in layers, it's going to be harder to hit certain spots.
Exactly. Like the head, neck, wrists, hands, ankles, those are usually exposed even in casual clothes. But if someone's wearing heavier clothing, those areas might be more protected.
So you got to adjust your strategy, right? Focus on the targets that are still accessible.
Right. And it's good to remember that even if you can't see a target directly, you can often still hit it. Like the knee, the shin, the solar plexus, those are all areas you can strike effectively through clothing.
And what about if someone's attacking you from behind?
Well, the book suggests going for the side of the neck if it's exposed, or the back of the knee, which is usually pretty easy to locate.
So it's all about like knowing your options, adapting to the situation, right?
Exactly. And that's really the key takeaway here. There's no single best target that will work in every situation. It depends on the context, the level of threat, the relative size and strength of the individuals involved. It's all got to be considered.
And ethical self-defense is about, using the minimum amount of force necessary and choosing targets that are appropriate for the situation.
Right. It's not about being a brutal fighter. It's about protecting yourself effectively.
Now, the book also gets into some practical training methods, right? Like how to actually develop those self-defense skills.
Right. And it stresses the importance of really focusing on your target. It suggests practicing your observation skills, like really paying attention to the shape, color, texture, mass of objects.
So it's about developing that precision, that awareness, right?
Exactly. And it gives some specific exercises you can do, like practicing on a swinging ball to get used to hitting a moving target, or working with a partner who throws a beach ball at you to improve your reaction time.
And what about if someone's attacking you from behind?
Well, the book suggests practicing turning quickly and then hitting a suspended ball with both your hands and your feet. It also recommends practicing visualizing targets, which can be helpful if you're in a situation where you can't see clearly.
So it's about training your mind as much as your body.
Right, exactly. Now, one thing the book kind of challenges is the idea of fighting stances. You know, those classic poses you see in martial arts movies?
Yeah, like the crane stance, the horse stance, those sorts of things.
Right. The book argues that those stances are often not very practical or realistic for real-world self-defense.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, in a real attack, you're probably not going to have time to, get into a perfect stance. It's going to be more chaotic, more unpredictable. And those stances are often designed for specific types of fighting, like, boxing or wrestling, which have rules and limitations that don't apply in a street fight.
So what does the book recommend instead?
It suggests adopting a more natural-looking, guarded posture, like keeping your hands up and ready, having a stable foot position, but not being so rigid that you can't move quickly.
So it's about being ready to react, but not about, looking like you're about to start a karate tournament.
Exactly. And the book also makes a really important distinction between sport matches and real-life self-defense. Like, the goals are different, the opponents are different, the rules are different. It's a whole different ballgame.
Right. In a sport, you're trying to score points according to a set of rules. In self-defense, you're trying to avoid becoming a victim, and there are no rules.
Exactly. And the target areas are different, too. In a lot of sports, the target areas are chosen for safety reasons. They're not the same areas you'd target in a real fight.
So like in a boxing match, you're not allowed to hit below the belt. But in a self-defense situation, all bets are off, right?
Right. And the book actually argues that the point system used in a lot of karate competitions is kind of outdated and dangerous. Like, a lot of the traditional target areas are really high risk, potentially even fatal.
So they're basically rewarding people for hitting each other in the most vulnerable spots.
Right. And the book suggests that karate competitions should really focus on lower risk target areas, like the upper arm, upper back, shoulder.
So it's about making the sport safer without sacrificing the skill and athleticism.
Exactly.
So to wrap things up, this deep dive into martial arts Dim Mak has been pretty eye-opening. It's made me think about self-defense in a whole new way.
It's about being prepared, being aware, and knowing how to respond appropriately to different levels of threat.
And it's about separating fact from fiction, right? Not getting caught up in those myths and legends.
Exactly. And understanding that effective self-defense doesn't always have to involve, like, brutal force or fancy techniques.
Sometimes it's about de-escalation, about using your words and your body language to deter an attack. And if you do have to use physical force, it's about being smart and choosing the right targets.
And the book leaves us with a really interesting question to think about. How does our understanding of the purpose behind different martial arts, whether it's for sport, tradition, or actual self-defense, affect how we evaluate those arts and their effectiveness in the real world?
It's a great question, and it's something that's worth considering as we continue to explore the world of martial arts and self-defense.